Hello, good morning. My name is Sam Thomas. I'm a senior advisor for the Regulatory Assistance Project and I lead their efficiency team in Europe. Today I'm going to present some research that I did with Stefan Scheuer and Jakob Graichen from the Öko-Institut. The focus of the research is on the forthcoming climate target architecture and directive reviews, which will be announced this summer, called the Fit for 55 package. And the research will look at the interactions between energy efficiency policy and the different elements of the climate target architecture before alighting on some specific research questions around how effort sharing regulation targets, that's the ESR on this title slide, can drive compliance with Article 7 Energy Efficiency Directive targets. So the presentation will begin with a brief look at the context. Then we'll describe how the different elements of the climate target architecture interact with the Energy Efficiency Directive. Then we'll look at some specific research questions around the effort sharing regulation and the EED, the scenarios that we chose, the findings, and finally some conclusions. Beginning with the context, the EU has committed to delivering a 55% net reduction in carbon emissions by 2030 relative to 2005 levels, and the Fit for 55 package is due to be announced on July the 14th and will cover at least 12 initiatives. Now, the main ones of interest to us are a revision of the EU ETS, which will reduce the cap on emissions in the power sector and amongst large industry installations. Potentially, a revision to the ETS may also see emissions trading extended to the other energy-related emissions that are currently covered by the effort sharing regulation. So that's direct emissions in buildings, in transport, in small industry facilities, and in the agriculture sector. And that could be done in one of a couple of ways. Could either see the current ETS extended or a parallel ETS set up in those other sectors. And if the combined caps in the two ETSs or the cap in the extended ETS are set in a way that is aligned with the 55% climate goal, then the need for the effort sharing regulation targets would be reduced. And in fact, they would be redundant, at least in terms of climate architecture, However, the setting of Fit for 55 emissions caps is far from a done deal. And if the caps in the traded sectors do not deliver sufficient emissions reductions to meet that 55% goal, then there will still be a role for the effort sharing regulation targets to drive actions by member states to ensure the integrity of the 55% goal. And we estimate that the effort sharing regulation targets, which currently stand at a 30% reduction by 2030 relative to 2005 at the EU level, would need to increase by 9 or 10 percentage points, so to around 39 or 40%. Alongside these changes to the climate target architecture, there will be changes to many other EU directives. The chief one of interest to us, of course, is a revision of the Energy Efficiency Directive. And our next slide will explain how the energy savings obligation contained within the EED interacts with the two elements of the climate target architecture. The Energy Efficiency Directive Article 7 energy savings obligation, in the centre of our diagram here, requires member states to make energy savings from national energy efficiency policy measures, and those policy measures should deliver energy savings in the industry, buildings, transport, agriculture sectors, which in turn should deliver greenhouse gas emissions reductions that either help to meet the effort sharing regulation targets, the national targets, or to keep the price down in the EU ETS. And this is an important distinction because it defines the role of Article 7 in different ways. On the ETS side of the house, the ETS is more than just a climate target architecture instrument. It's also a carbon pricing policy instrument in its own right. That creates potential synergies with the types of policy measures that are taken up under Article 7 Energy Efficiency Directive. The ETS creates an allowance price which gets fed through into the energy prices facing end consumers, and that makes energy efficiency investments more attractive. If Article 7 can then focus on overcoming the other market failures and barriers that affect the take-up of energy efficiency actions, then the two can work hand in hand, and the role of Article 7 becomes to keep a lid on the prices in the EU ETS, which, if uncontrolled, would both affect energy poverty negatively, but also affect the political sustainability of the climate targets as a whole. On the other side of the house, with the effort sharing regulation targets, the relationship between Article 7 and the national targets is much more direct. Article 7 helps to meet the national targets that member states have, and at the same time, if member states' national targets are higher, that should drive compliance with the energy savings obligation, because member states will need more energy efficiency actions to ensure that they meet their national targets. And it's this set of interactions on the right-hand side of this diagram that underpins our two research questions. So our first research question is, how could an increased Article 7 EED energy savings obligation contribute to the achievement of higher ESR targets? And then secondly, what impact would higher ESR targets have on member states' compliance with an increased energy savings obligation? And in order to answer those research questions, we set up some scenarios. So we have a baseline scenario, which is the Primes EU Code 3235. And in the baseline, we see that effort sharing regulation emissions actually reduce by 33%. So already we're overachieving the 30% target, at least at EU level. Then we have two sets of scenarios. So the first scenario essentially just increases the effort sharing regulation targets to 39%, and then we vary the way in which those increased targets are spread across the member states. The first scenario maintains the 40 percentage point spread between member states. So at the moment, Bulgaria has basically a 0% target, and Luxembourg a 40% target. In this scenario, we essentially just shift all of those targets to the right, so that Bulgaria now has a minus 10% target, Luxembourg a minus 50% target, and other countries have targets somewhere in between, in direct relation to their current targets. Then we have another scenario, 2b, in which we have exactly the same increase in the ESR targets at EU level, but we squeeze the spread, we narrow it, so that the member states that currently have very little effort have more effort to make in the narrow spread option. Then in our scenario 3, we take scenarios 2a and 2b, and we essentially add an increased energy savings obligation target. The current national targets that member states face is to make energy savings, new annual energy savings of 0.8% of historic energy consumption per year. And in our modelling, we simply added an additional 0.8% to the energy savings obligation from 2025 onwards, i.e. for the remaining 6 years of the 2021 to 2030 compliance period. Why a doubling? Well, it's a kind of a round number to double, but there is a broader justification to the increase in the target. We triangulated with the work of Fraunhofer, who have done estimates of the remaining cost-effective energy efficiency potential, and this increase in the energy savings obligation would mean that roughly half of the remaining cost-effective potential would need to be delivered. Coming to our results, at the EU level we see that our light green bar here, our baseline emissions, are at minus 33%, which takes us further than the current ESR target, the DOT, which is set at 30%. And in order to get from our current baseline of minus 33% to the tougher ESR targets that would be required to meet the 55% climate goal, which is set at 39 or 40%, down here, this dark bar here, a doubling of the energy savings obligation between 2025 and 2030 would deliver half of that increase in greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So that's the EU situation, energy savings delivering half of the gap. But the situation varies dramatically across member states. For 6 member states, Greece, Hungary, Malta, Portugal, Estonia and Croatia, it doesn't matter whether the effort sharing regulation targets would be set using our narrow spread or the current spread. In all cases, baseline emissions are already below even those tougher emissions reduction targets. But we have other member states where there is more of interest. Slovenia, Latvia, Romania. Here we see that only if there's a narrow spread will more greenhouse gas emissions reductions need to be made than is in the current baseline. So that means that the design of the effort sharing regulation targets could have an impact on the drive for genuine energy savings under the EED Article 7 energy savings obligation. Then we got a broad swathe of emissions in Germany, Sweden, France, Spain, Italy, Czechia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Poland and Bulgaria, where simply having an increased effort sharing regulation target should mean that more effort is put into energy savings. Under the current targets, the 30% dots here on this slide, all of these member states do not need to put in additional effort than is already baked into the baseline. But if the targets are raised to 39% on either a narrow spread or the current spread, more effort is going to be required. And then we have the countries with the more challenging effort sharing regulation targets: Finland, Denmark, Belgium, Austria, the Netherlands, Cyprus, Ireland and Luxembourg, for whom the 30% target is already challenging and should be driving action towards meeting the Article 7 energy savings obligation. So let's just test that hypothesis. To what extent does a higher effort sharing regulation target actually drive compliance with Article 7 EED? And the striking thing that we notice is that the countries on the right here, these are the countries that I've just been mentioning, so Cyprus, Finland, Belgium, Austria, Netherlands, Denmark, Ireland, all of those countries who have got the higher and more challenging effort sharing regulation targets, where the target is already set below baseline emissions, in all of those countries they are deemed likely or very likely by the European Commission to meet their Article 7 EED targets. The one exception to the rule is Luxembourg, who actually have got the toughest ESR targets, but having spoken to the teams in Luxembourg, we know that they've had some teething problems with their EEO and they are being dealt with. So our hypothesis is that this set of countries in the middle to lower part of this distribution, who are predominantly red, so very unlikely or unlikely to meet Article 7 EED targets, will put more effort into meeting those targets over the 2020s if the effort sharing regulation targets are increased. And that should be good news for the energy efficiency industry. So in conclusion, achieving the increased effort sharing regulation targets will require significantly more energy efficiency gains, and a doubling of Article 7 targets will get us halfway to tougher effort sharing regulation targets at around 39%. Higher effort sharing regulation targets should drive compliance with Article 7 EED targets. A narrower spread of the effort sharing regulation targets will drive compliance in more countries. A carbon price for current effort sharing regulation emissions would make energy efficiency actions more financially attractive, and targeted Article 7 Energy Efficiency Directive policy measures essential in order to keep the price down in the ETS system. Removing the effort sharing regulation, however, would risk dropping the ball on energy efficiency. And with that, I will conclude and ask if anyone has any questions. Thank you.